Here is one of Dan's closest friends in the paddock, the public relations director for Panther Racing, Mike Kitchell.
On the rare times that I had to do public speaking during our time at Panther together, Dan would spend the entire day telling me how great a job I was going to do. And then right before I'd come on stage, he'd go, "Bro, two things. Don't screw up, and your fly's undone. Go." But I want to thank the family very much for giving me this opportunity to be up here. It's obviously an honor to be associated with Dan and his career, and obviously Susie and the boys, and to be able to see Dan grow the way he did was quite remarkable. And I brought up two of my closest friends, Benito Santos and Misty Gibbs. For the 2 years that Dan was at Panther, the three of us plus Dan and Susie are pretty much inseparable. And much like Adrian and Mickey explained, we had a little phone game of our own. Dan was notorious for stealing our phones, and when he would steal our phones, he would effectively text message everyone in our contact list, and it was everything. We would agree to lunches, agree to meetings, and in Benito's case, do you want to tell them what he would do when he stole your phone?
Just text random guys saying, "Hey, you look good today. Hey, you're cute. I want to see you."
It's true. But we would also conspire to steal one another's phones, and I think one of our fondest things to do when we were stealing phones was to steal Misty's phone and give guys the wrong idea. I think the first of such instances happened with Charles Burns, our beloved security chief at IndyCar, and I think Misty would like to tell you what Dan sent to Charles.
Yes, Dan decided to take my phone and text to Charles Burns, who I had hardly met, maybe met once, that sometimes I lie awake at night thinking of your big, strong hands. So, of course, since this was the first time this had happened to me, the text messaging and stealing phones, when I saw Charles the next day and he said, "Hey." That really kicked it off. And I actually have my phone in my pocket right now because I still never go anywhere without it.
But our favorite instance of the phone stealing game, as we called it, came. We were at dinner one night, and my wife Carmen joined us, and I went off to the bathroom, and Dan somehow got my phone. I have no idea how. And Dan sent Carmen a message while I was at the bathroom, and it was something along the lines of, "Baby, you look so hot tonight, I'd like to blank, 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 blank." And he waited for a minute, and she didn't get the text, so he thought he'd send her another one. "Hey, sweetie, you look so great tonight. Why don't we go to specific place?" And blank, 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 blank. Well, I'd finally come back to the dinner table, and Carmen hadn't seen the messages yet, and Dan couldn't handle it. He was like, "Carmen, did you get the messages?" And while my wife, Carmen, was looking to find where these mystery text messages have gone, I got a pretty awkward phone call from my brother-in-law, Cameron. And Cameron wasn't buying the whole, "My race car driver friend Dan sent you those messages." I actually hope he's watching this so he'll finally believe that it was Dan that sent those text messages. But turning a little bit serious, guys, and in closing, we talk a lot about what our sport needs to grow and what changes we need to make to the Indianapolis 500 down the street to continue to make it the greatest sporting event in the world. And, I don't know if our cars need to look like Delaras or Delta Wings. And I don't know. I'm certainly not smart enough to tell you guys where we need to race, but I know the one thing we control is ourselves and the type of people that we are. And if we could somehow capture 1/10 of the millions and millions of things that made Dan Wheldon great, being courteous, compassionate, never too busy to stop and speak with a fan, and able to recognize that every once in a while you have a small window to make a positive difference in somebody's life, or just to make somebody feel special. I think if we could all do that, that we could take the sport wherever we wanted. But there's one catch with that. No matter how much we want to be like Dan, no matter how much he inspires us, and no matter how many drivers come along and try to emulate him, there's only one Dan Wheldon. And we love you, bro.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Managing Director for Chip Ganassi Racing, Mr. Mike Hull.
When Susie asked me to speak today, saying yes was a given, but having the strength to stand up here and do this is very, very difficult. You know, with Dan, this last week for me, I've had a little bit of an issue medically, and I'm having a tough time seeing, so even with the teleprompter, I may have a problem. But I know that's on purpose. I know Dan did that just to stick the needle in really, really well, because what he's done here is he's taken a race guy, made him with one eye try to be a speechwriter, and then follow that up by actually speaking about him. So I know what happened. I'm waiting this morning, and I'm waiting for the text from Dan. I'm waiting for this text that says, "Hey, MH, I know you're going to talk about me today, so whatever you do, you got to make me look good." That was Dan Wheldon, and Dan, you know, in this case, I'm going to try to make you look good. Under normal circumstances, we'd take you apart. Dan Wheldon was all about engagement. His belief is that life was better when it was shared with each other. That was Dan Wheldon's ethic. His unique ability to get everybody in the room engaged made all of us better. Everyone is here today for various reasons. You know, it could have been somebody, up there in that upper area, unfortunately you're up there, I'm sorry, that just got an autograph. It could be somebody that just enjoyed the fact that Dan Wheldon did something better than most anybody can ever do, drive an IndyCar. It could have been a sponsor. It could be a kid that he visited in a hospital. It could be somebody in the first few rows here that have been friends for life. His sphere of engagement had long tentacles. That was very evidenced by the global outpouring that we saw this week. His brand was clearly engaged integrity. Susie asked me to talk about the time that we spent together at Chip Ganassi Racing and speak to Dan Wheldon. So it'll go something like this. In 2008, in January of 2008, our first race experience with Dan Wheldon was at the 24 Hours of Daytona. It wasn't an open-wheel race. He was paired with two target teammates. One was a guy named Casey Mears, whose only experience in endurance racing was driving an off-road truck from Ensenada to La Paz. His other teammate was a guy named Scott Dixon, who relishes driving at Daytona, and you can't pry him out of the car. And we have Dan Wheldon, who is the superstar guy that couldn't road race worth a lick. He'd grown up in intermediate formula cars on road racing, but you know, he learned his craft in big cars that turn left. So it was an interesting situation. And on top of that, the car itself was being maintained by a bunch of IndyCar guys. An endurance race for an IndyCar mechanic or an IndyCar crew member is the 4 hours between the time Jim Neighbors sings and you drink the milk. That's it. That's an endurance race for us. So you got IndyCar guys doing this thing. We're racing Daytona. The race starts. Dixon does what he loves to do. He gets out and he's leading. He's going. Casey Mears climbs in after Dixon's double stint, so he's in the car for 2 stints, and Dan's next. Dan's like the anchor guy now. So he jumps in the car and off he goes. I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be great. Everything's okay. Indy 500 winner, you know, Dan Wheldon, we're doing okay. And our timing stand, in a way, was maybe kind of like the Starship Enterprise conning tower, the con, right before the Romulans got ready to attack. Because it's really quiet, everybody's happy, there's nothing going on. All of a sudden, in my headset, we've got the spotter, we got the car, and then we've got this thing called an intercom, so everybody can talk to each other whenever they want to, without invitation. And the next thing I know, Shaggy, who is our Toyota TRD engine guy, he's screaming at the top of his lungs, "You got to get Wheldon to stop over revving the motor. He's over revving on the upshifts. He's over revving on the downshifts. What's he going to do? We're only going to be in the race for an hour. He's already way past where he needs to be with the revs." Okay. Grant Weaver, who looks after our transmissions, is in the back of the stand, and he's watching what's going on with the screens, and he jumps up in my face, and he says, "If Wheldon keeps missing shifts like that, the whole gear carrier is going to be against the magnets in the bottom of the gearbox. We're not going to finish the race." Simmons, the engineer, is yelling and screaming, he cannot continue to use the engine and gearbox like a Jake brake. And at the same time, the spotter now, you got to understand there were 28 prototype cars and 48 GT cars. This is a big field. The spotter is yelling, Harner, he's yelling at Dan, and he's saying, "You've got to stop using GT cars as apexes." So I'm taking all this in a nanosecond, trying to think, now what am I supposed to do? This is Dan Wheldon, the Indy 500 champion. We signed this guy to drive for us. He's got to know how to drive one of these cars. Am I supposed to teach him how to drive on the radio in the next hour? Doesn't he realize we've got 18 hours to go? So I get on the radio, I'm watching the screen, watching where he's at on the racetrack, watching the data, listen to these guys yell in my ear. Now I'm teaching Dan Wheldon how to drive a race car on the radio. Amazing. After about 55 minutes of this, Dan starts to figure it out. So now we have like the Christians and the Lions going on the timing stand. Simply, it's either thumbs up or thumbs down. Are we leaving him in for another stint? Or are we putting Dixon back in? So it was kind of a divided vote. I made the decision to leave him in. And he stayed in for another stint. By the middle of the next stint, he was doing okay. He was actually holding his own. He was running well. Everything was okay. He gets out of the car. Dixon gets in, and off he goes. So Dan jumps up on the stand, and I think he's going to think, he starts to tell us about the car. Oh, the balance of the car is this. If we just did a little bit of that, it'd be better. Well, he didn't realize how Chip Ganassi racing actually works. He was attacked by the guy that does the brakes, the guy that does the body work, the guy that does the tires, the TRD guy that looks after the engines. Simmons and I had to step back. These guys are taking him apart because they took ownership in the product, and he was beating it up pretty good on a racetrack. So he steps off the stand, and the next guy in his face is the owner. Now, the owner uses very short sentences, and they're adjective-filled. I won't repeat what was said there because I know we have a G-rated audience. But Dan fully understood that if he came back to drive the next stint, he'd better do a good job because that's what drivers at Chip Ganassi Racing actually do for each other. So off he went. He did get in the car again. He did a great job, and never will forget. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning. And Casey was driving the car. In fact, he was doing a great job. He was learning depth perception in the dark following his teammate, Max Pappas. And for anybody that ever wants to see how you win the 24 hours at Daytona, that's what you want to watch. You want to watch that portion of the race. That's when you gain track position. That's when you win. And Casey's out there pounding around, and he's doing an awesome job. And suddenly in the dark on our left, up on the stand, pops Dan Wheldon. I thought, man, that's odd. He's not supposed to be back out here till about 7:30. I said, Dan, what are you doing? You're supposed to be sleeping. And he says, sleep's overrated. He says, I've decided I need to be out here so I can learn as much as I can so I can be productive when I get back in the car at 7:30. I said, man, you need your sleep. He says, no, I'm here with you. I'm going to help you. He says, whatever you need, I'll do it for you. You know, and I'd heard all these stories about Dan, and I'd heard all the stories about the needle, and I'd heard all the stories about how he put you on. So I'm looking at him right square in the eye, and I'm trying to figure out, did this guy just set his alarm clock to get up to screw with me? Or is he serious? So I dropped the headset off my head, and I looked at him square in the eye, and I said, Dan, I'll tell you what, if you really want to help us, here's what you can do. Believe it or not, we're freezing our asses off up here on this timing stand. We don't have any heat to keep us warm. If you could go off somewhere and find an electric blanket and a long extension cord, that would really help us. And the second thing is, I don't know what happened back there at hospitality, but the chef must have fallen asleep because we haven't had anything warm or hot to eat for about 4 hours up here. We're starving. And he looked at me. I remember it was January 29th, 4 o'clock in the morning. That started my relationship right there with Dan Wheldon. He split. Didn't say anything, left. Jumped off the stand and left. Simmons says to me, where do you think he went? I said, he either went back to his coach to sleep until 7 o'clock, or he's going to be back with food. About 30 minutes later, he comes back looking like a buttoned-up guy from St. Elmo's. He then proceeded to go around to every crew member who was sitting in chairs, trying to sleep now. He's waking them up because they don't have to get up for another 45 minutes to service the car, and he's telling them what a great job they're doing, whatever they need. He's there for them. This guy was all about engagement. He wanted to engage everybody in the process. That's what he did. One of the greatest things was this group of IndyCar guys that were given absolutely no chance to win that race won the race. We won with a race with a guy that could only turn left, a guy that only drove in Mexico for endurance racing, and a race driver, a quality guy that knows how to get it done on a road track. We won the race. A few days later, Dan came to the building, and he comes in my office, and he closes the door, and like Mickey was talking about, I'm thinking, oh, my God, now what's going to happen? Is he going to talk about his closet in the truck? Does he want me to fire his engineer? Does he not like his crew chief? Is the wrong guy driving his truck? Does he not like his uniform? Is it not pressed right? He says, Mike, I got to tell you something. He said, I discovered something at Daytona. So what's that, Dan? When I left Andretti Racing, I wasn't sure I made the right decision. I won races there. Those guys were great, great guys to race with. I had great teammates there. I miss all of those guys. I could be winning races with those guys right now. You know that. He said, but I knew at 4 o'clock in the morning at Daytona how committed you guys are to winning. I made the right decision. 45 days later, we were at Homestead for the IndyCar race, the opening round of the IndyCar race, and Dan won the race. That was big for Chip Ganassi Racing. That was huge. I don't know, you people that are historians of IndyCar racing will understand that in 2004 and 2005, it was put to us pretty hard. The only races we had an opportunity to win were the short tracks and the road tracks, where horsepower wasn't really important. And Scott Dixon did his fair share to try to prove that point and did that for us. But outside of that, we sucked on the ovals. We were terrible. Dan, I think, felt he took a chance by coming over to us because of that reason. We'd switched partners. We had Honda engines, but, we were learning about Dallara. And what we'd been doing for 2 years in our building is we'd been pushing our people really, really hard to try to get our cars through the air. That was a big deal for us. Mechanically and aero-wise, we didn't really know if we were on the right track. We thought we were, but we didn't really have a product that could prove it. Dan Wheldon proved that to us right away. He came around in the building and explained to everybody how important it was, what they did. Every person in the building was immediately engaged by Dan Wheldon. He was part of the process from the start. He wasn't one of those guys that just turned up at the racetrack in his jet, had somebody park his car, ate catered food, and left. This guy was in the middle of everything we were doing. He was fantastic. I had never, ever, up to that point in time, been around a guy on an oval that could drive a car like Dan Wheldon. He was magical. He was amazing. He was impressive. Quite frankly, all the guys that went through our driver parade up until Dan Wheldon, when I started working for Chip was in 1992. The first guy I dealt with or worked for, was a chief mechanic for, was a guy named Eddie Cheever. And right after that, a guy came along named Ari Lyondike, and that guy on a big oval was amazing. I hadn't seen anybody on an oval even close to that since Ari was with us. And we had some pretty good guys. But Dan was head and shoulders above all those guys. I'll say this for the people that understand this. Any guy that can go on a racetrack and drive with 100 pounds of left front cross weight and not flinch and come in, if he can't turn the steering wheel to the right at the exit of the corner, is somebody pretty special. The guy was impressive. Scott Dixon thought he was pretty good on ovals. And at the beginning when Dan turned up, Scott and I don't think Scott and Dan were the best of friends. I think they had a tough time with each other. They were trying to grow with each other. They were trying to learn. But what they had in common is they had racing in common. Racing is what drove them together. It created a friendship that is pretty special now. But at the time, they couldn't figure it out. But as the year went on, they started to get together, everything started to work, and all of a sudden Scott started, he was looking at the data, he's going, man, I don't really understand how he can do that. I've got to work on that. I think today, Scott Dixon will tell you why he's so good on an oval. At the end of that first season, Wheldon came to me and he said, I got a real problem. I'm thinking, oh no, what now? He said, Dixon's better than I am on an oval. I said, well, I thought you kept a little bit close to the best. He said, I didn't. I said, well, then you better go back to Dixon because you're going to need some help next year because he's on fire. So those two guys were pretty good together. I brought a prop with me, and I just wanted to bring this up, and it kind of reflects what everybody thinks that we're all about business, We look at the data stream, we do all of these things, we're all business. And we were at Indianapolis, I think it was in 2008, maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8, I don't remember. I should probably write this stuff down for the book. But we'd already qualified, we qualified pretty well, and the difference between Wheldon and Dixon is simply this. Wheldon loved qualifying. He loved going fast. He loved 4 laps at the Speedway more than anybody I've ever met. Those 4 laps to him were awesome. I remember asking him about qualifying one day, and he said to me, let me explain it to you like this. He says, when the car is right across the short chutes, it's like driving on a slick track. Think about that, like driving on a slick track. He said, you barely hold on to the wheel. You let the car drive across there. The car drives you. You don't drive the car when it's right. He loved qualifying at Indianapolis. It was fun to be around him on that day. And Scott, on the other hand, always was miserable if he didn't qualify well. But Scott loved racing. He loved being ready for the race. He loved working on the car. He loved being out there pounding around, and that's what we've always done with Scott, is get ready to race. So we had a meeting in the morning, I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday morning of the second week, and we got this big grand plan that we're going to go out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're going to fill the cars up, and we're going to go out, and we're going to chase each other around the racetrack, and we're going to go through maybe 3 sets of tires or 4 sets of tires if everything worked right, and work on race stuff. So I'm on Dixon's stand, and I'm out there. No Dan. We wait about 15 or 20 minutes, and Dixon says, screw it, let's go. So we're on the racetrack, and he finds Briscoe or Helio or somebody like that to run around with in the first run. We make some changes. No Dan. Make another run. Still no Dan. Finally, about 2:30 in the afternoon, here comes, just Dixon finally says on the intercom to us, he says, we might as well go back to the garage. Just as that happens, around a corner comes a golf cart with a 10 car with Wheldon sitting on it. And it was a nice sunny spring day in Indianapolis, probably one of the first days the sun was really out, and this is what we saw. So Golf cart pulls up. The guys unhook the car. They're getting ready to go. Dan's in his car's in his box, and Dan comes walking back to Dixon. Puts his head in the cockpit. And this is normally where, like, Vince Welch would be standing there with a microphone, and he'd be saying to the ESPN viewers, well, Dixon and Wheldon, now they're getting ready to run on a racetrack. They're probably talking right now about what they're going to do together when they run, because when you run close at 220 miles an hour, this is precision driving. It has to be right. So we've got, the intercom is still plugged into the car, so we hear this conversation that Vince is talking about. Dan puts his head in the car and he says, hey, bro, how's the car? Dixon says, it's about bloody time you showed up out here. Why does it take them so long back there in the garage for those your guys, to put my setup on your car? He says, well, I appreciate you running all the setup stuff. It's going to make it a lot easier on me on race day. So Dan steps away from the car, and Dick says, let's go, man. Let's get going. So then Dixon says, oh, Dan, hey, one more thing. I said, what's that? He says, when they make those in men's, I'll have a pair. So you simply think we talk about the cars all the time? We don't. At Las Vegas, I was talking to Dan, and he said to me, hey, I got to come by the building in a couple of weeks. I need my picture taken with a trophy. I said, with what trophy? And he said, with that A.J. Foyt oval trophy, the one that Dixon just got. I said, really? You want a picture with that? He said, yeah. He says, I assume by now Chip's had my name etched on that thing because I'm the reason that Dixon does what he does on ovals now. So we were going to make something up. We talked about it. We may still do that in memory of Dan, because Dan truly is. He's a teammate. He was a friend. He made it happen for us under race situations all the time. We're very fortunate to have had our lives enhanced by Dan Wheldon. He was one of the best things at Chip Ganassi Racing that has ever happened to me. Even better was that Dan didn't let a little thing like moving to another race team get in the way of a good friendship. It actually made us stronger together. Wins and championships define us professionally, but the interaction of friendship outlasts it all, and Dan proved that. I've come to the realization how strongly that Dan felt about life. First, he remembered where he came from. Success didn't change him. It really only allowed him to do more for those around him. He reminded us that achievement is best as a shared experience. He taught me that the importance of unselfish support lasts a lifetime, and that's truly what defines friendship. For him, it was the passion of today that counted the most. For him, it wasn't just about what was done on track together. That's only the catalyst. That's the denominator that drove us closer together. It was the rare and special ability that Dan had to love life and to teach us truly that was a shared experience. It made us all better. When my dad died a few years ago, someone very close to me said that you shouldn't place faith in time, as the hands on the clock will soon stand still. In my life, there have only been a few people, and I can count them on one hand, that have accepted each other, that have taken each other with simple acceptance, and that was Dan Wheldon. He's clearly in that circle. His ethic was to live life with the time available and to accept each other at face value. Dan will always be one of those who used every minute to make our world better. In his brief time, Dan achieved what few have ever been able to achieve professionally, but more importantly, personally. He used winning on the racetrack to make a difference, and that's the sheer magnitude of his positive influence for all our lives. Knowing Dan Wheldon made me a better person, and that's the definition of true friendship. I'm going to miss him.